The elevator. It was a warm evening, but I was holed up in my apartment because I was taking care of my 3-month-old daughter. It was 9 p.m. and my husband was still at work. He'd been working late shifts so he could better support us, and I was used to him arriving well past midnight by now. Still, I was feeling beside myself with boredom and hadn't had any social gathering since the baby had been born. My doctor had advised me to go outside for a few walks, even with the baby, if it meant I wasn't spending all my time cooped up in the apartment. Thinking that the doctor's advice wasn't the worst, I picked up my baby and headed downstairs for that walk. I live on the 13th floor in a 23-floor apartment building. I spent an hour near the pier and was feeling refreshed. Near the end of my walk, however, I saw a man a little distance away. He was seated in one of the benches and was following his gaze in my direction. I moved around to make sure whether he was specifically staring in my way, and unfortunately confirmed he was looking at me. The pier was filled with people, so I didn't have to worry about this man pursuing me. Still, it left me shaken. I saw 3 older men lying on the grass deep in conversation and sat on a bench near them to make it seem like I could be mistaken for one of their daughter. The man, however, got up from the bench he was on and sat on one adjacent to mine. He was clearly trying to make it look like it was a casual move, but I could see his eyes in my direction. The area was beginning to clear and my apartment building was just behind me. I couldn't walk far away because I had my baby and she would be waking up anytime soon. The only people nearby were the 3 older men and the strange man. A few seconds later, the 3 men rose up and started walking away. I noticed the strange man turn his head in my direction pointedly, and on instinct, I got up as well and headed toward my building. I was relieved to see that the 3 older men were also heading for my building and wanted to stay close by so that the strange man couldn't get me alone. Around this time, the men noticed I was deliberately walking close, and I saw one nudge the others to inform them of this. Figuring it was better to come clean, I smiled gratefully and was met with smiles from all 3 as well. We stopped at the elevator door when I saw the man following me standing by the entrance of the building. The men signaled for me to enter the elevator with them. I wasn't comfortable with the idea, but then felt one of them bump into me from behind, causing me to lurch into the lift, which closed with all 4 of us in. It was then that I got a good look of their faces. They were all very old, at least in their late 60s, with their hair almost balding and the few wisps that remained all silver. None of them had all of their teeth remaining and has several missing. I knew this because they were looking down at me with open-mouthed grins. The 3 men faced me as I was backed into the corner of the tiny lift. "Excuse me," I muttered and pressed myself to the edge of the lift because I had no room to myself. I had hoped this would be indication for them to give me more space. Instead, the 3 old men kept staring at me with those broken teeth and hungry eyes. I was regretting ever approaching them in the first place. "Can you please give me some space?" I asked, feeling concerned for my daughter who was stirring in my arms. The first man cackled at my feeble voice, while his friends joined in the laughter. I could only shift my eyes from one man to the other in confusion. None of them had pressed any buttons on the elevator to take us up to any floor, and I hadn't dared press the number for my own floor because I had a feeling they wouldn't let me simply walk out. "Please keep a distance," I found a firmer voice, and hearing it, one of them backed up a bit. However, the other 2 laughed at his momentary weakness and howled with their chests bulging. I realized none of them knew how to speak English and were entertaining themselves with my attempts at communication. These men were all very large as well, and each of them had huge guts sticking in front of them, causing the elevator to have barely any room. I noticed, with every laugh, they would inch closer to me. I was disgusted at the men's intentions. These men were old enough to be my grandfather, yet they were looking at me like I was an object of satisfaction. The first one raised his bulgy hand made to grab me. I instantly swatted his hand away. My baby dug her face deeper into chest, or maybe it was me who was holding her tighter. "Don't you dare!" I warned the man, raising a defiant finger to point at him. My voice had become shrill with shock, but the men were merely amused at my hysteria. They laughed harder at my defensive stance and, to my further disgust, imitated me. Two of them crouched in position and pretended to wrestle, all the while making sounds that were supposed to mimic me. The first man howled with laughter while smacking his large stomach. I moved to push the button to open the elevator doors, but the man saw this coming and pressed the button for the 23rd floor. I knew enough from their mannerisms that they had only bad intentions with me, and I would have been prepared to fight had my daughter not been in my arms. It was then that my baby woke up and began crying due to the clustered environment. To my horror, the first man held out his hands, motioning for me to give him my daughter. The men spoke in an unintelligible language. It sounded more like gibberish than actual words. Their demeanor had changed from joking to dead seriousness. The first man put himself flat against the elevator doors and seemed to gyrate in his position as if offering to let me go in exchange for something. The other two men began laughing once more. The second man placed his hands on the chest of the third and made disgusting gestures. All this happened within the span of a few minutes, and I knew I had to get out as soon as I could. I pressed the button to the closest floor and the doors opened. The first man almost toppled out of the lift, which is why I attempted to escape. The other two men, unfortunately, made to grab my baby, and to avoid this from happening I had to retreat back into the elevator. Now, the men had forgotten about their laughter. The first man threw all his playfulness aside, moving toward me. I'd reached the end of my tether and began screaming for help. Before the man could cover my mouth, the lift doors opened and two hands reached inside, pulling the man away. I saw him fall to the ground in pain. It was the stranger from downstairs. He threw another punch at the second old man, who also fell to the floor. The third man made no attempt to attack and pulled himself back. The young man indicated for me to follow, and I leaped out of the lift. I was grateful to this man for potentially saving my life and my baby's. He accompanied me to the ground floor through the stairs, where we called the police. The old men in the elevator were taken away. It was by this point when I found out why this man had been following me in the first place. He told me how he had seen the three men harass another woman a couple weeks ago and wanted to stay close to avoid the same fate happening to me. He'd been about to warn me when I had unwittingly chosen to escape with the three men. The young man had noticed the lift hadn't moved for a while and surmised I was in trouble. By looking at the floor where we had stopped, after I pushed the button to the nearest floor, he had run up the stairs to rescue me. I learned an important lesson that night: to never judge anyone based on appearances. The men who harassed me were old, but my first instinct had been to trust them and question a young man who had my best interests at heart. I still live in the same building, but I make sure never to enter the elevator when there aren't many people around. I've seen the young man who saved me around since then, and he's become something of a brother figure for me. The only consolation I can take from my harrowing experience is that while there are terrible people out there, there are good ones too. The imaginary friend. I was a fresh widow thrust into responsibility after the death of my husband. His passing had left me only a box of his possessions and the custody of his son. We moved into a new neighborhood after neither of us could bear to stay in our former home, where the memories of my husband seemed to haunt our days. I wanted a new start, and with it came a new job, along with a new school for JJ, my stepson. As my busy schedule meant JJ was alone, I bought him a pet dog to go with the stray cat he'd adopted from the garden. One day, I came home from work early to pick something I'd forgotten, only to find JJ in his room. He was supposed to be at school. Before I entered, I heard JJ talking. He wasn't alone. I picked up a bat I kept for precaution and sneaked into the room. To my surprise, there was nobody there except JJ. He told me he'd come back home. He'd missed him too much. JJ wouldn't tell me who him was, but was ecstatic just mentioning him. When I asked him to describe this man, JJ pointed toward the wall. He's there, you can talk to him, too. JJ jumped on the bed, we can all play together. I stared at the wall. Could there be an intruder in the house? Raising a trembling hand, I felt the wall's surface. There was nothing there. I scolded JJ for making up tales and cutting school, but he only had his new friend on his mind. I decided to let him be happy with his imagination. Before I left, I heard him whisper, "She's gone, let's jump on the bed together." Over time, JJ became happier. He didn't have any more bouts of solitude. He never asked for anything. In fact, he hardly spoke to me anymore. All he did now was sneak around the house as if I would catch him. However, his friend obsession got out of hand as I learned he hadn't informed me about a class trip and instead spent his day in the garden. My friend was teaching me how to hunt the way Dad used to, he argued when I scolded him. "I'm going to be able to kill anything. You'll see." I noted his hands were splattered with blood. Blood that wasn't his. I followed the trail over toward a bush, behind which lay several corpses of birds. They hadn't just been killed, they'd been savaged. The birds' wings had been ripped off, and their beaks had been shattered. I slowly turned to look at JJ. "I'll be good enough to kill bigger things soon," he chirped. Any mention of the friend was banned after the incident. I put my foot down and threatened to strike JJ if he put another toe out of line or skipped school. Things went back to the way they were before JJ met his friend, and I had a depressed child in my hands once more. JJ would refuse to talk to me, shutting himself in his room. I thought I'd let him deal with this on his own until he was ready to talk, but was called by the school a few weeks later. According to them, JJ was involving himself too much into the female students. He would interject himself in their groups and refuse to leave, even talking their dolls and playing with them. The girls had complained to their teacher over how JJ began displaying voyeuristic tendencies, with one girl claiming he had attempted to look under her skirt. Not being able to deal with this on my own, I took JJ to a child specialist. The doctor informed me JJ was feeling the loss of his father hard and was lashing out the frustrations he had on me over to the girls in school. To my surprise, the doctor told me to allow JJ to talk to his friend since he believed he was talking to his father. JJ was over the moon when I consented to his friend and promised me I would grow to love him as well, that we wouldn't miss my husband anymore. I still felt uneasy. JJ became more and more rash with his interests. I'd see him try and drop birds from midair by chucking jagged rocks at them. He would talk about women as if he were a man who knew everything about their anatomy and was now prone to striking inanimate objects hard as if testing his strength. One day, I found him on the way to his room and spotted a pair of briefs in his grasp. Too large for a child, they were clearly a man's. I confronted JJ over where he got them, and after attempting to conceal it, he admitted he'd searched through his father's belongings and extracted the briefs from his undergarments. I was both dumbstruck and enraged. Why would he want to do this? Before I could scold him, JJ raised a hand in my face and snarled, "No questions. My father's dead. And now there's a new man of the house." With that, he slammed the door of his room while I stood there. From inside, I heard him ask his friend how he was now ready to wear big boy pants. Again, I implored upon the doctor, who theorized JJ was trying to live up to his father's image. He insisted I waited out till JJ was emotionally ready to talk about my husband's passing. But I was starting to feel afraid in a way that made me feel uncomfortable, as if I was going to be attacked. JJ had stopped playing with his pets for a while now, and my solace was being around them. The dog and the cat were the only living things I felt easy around. When I came back from the doctor, I couldn't find either of the pets. Heading into the garden, I found JJ, who was busy setting up his video camera. He developed a habit of creating vlogs. Figuring I'd call the pets by taking their food out, I entered the kitchen where I screamed. The fridge was ajar, the frozen meat sloppily pulled out from the freezer, and the partially thawed out meat was scattered along a trail that ended with a bowl. The dog had his jaws shoved inside this bowl, where he was devouring the bloody remains of the cat decorated with the meat from the fridge. The kitchen was splattered with blood around the walls. There wasn't anywhere I'd look where there wasn't murky red drenched over. The cat's head poked out of the bowl, its white eyes locked onto mine. And I felt as if the dog was devouring me. I still hadn't stopped screaming as the horror set into me. JJ walked in with his camera, narrating his entry into the scene. He said he wouldn't start without me. JJ hunched his shoulders in pity. I wanted to record it. I bellowed at the boy for thinking this was his idea of fun. But JJ insisted it was his friend who'd done this, not him. Undeterred, JJ took the camera out and began filming the familiars of the cat that the dog was hounding down, even amused by how exciting his friend would find this video. I slapped the camera hard out of JJ's hands, sending it crashing onto the ground where it shattered. Instantly, JJ's face contorted in fury. He gave me a deep look of loathing. I thought he'd yell back at me, but what he said terrified me even more. My friend was right. You do need a man inside you. This time I slapped JJ in the face. I could never have imagined him talking to me in such a disgusting manner. Rather than cry, JJ smirked and went to his room. Before turning in, I called the doctor, who was alarmed at what JJ had done. The doctor instructed me to bring JJ in the first thing the next day and keep an eye on him in the meantime. I couldn't feel safe knowing JJ was awake. So, I tread lightly over to his room, where I heard him speaking to himself again. I turned the key on the lock ever so silently so he wouldn't know I'd sealed him in before returning to bed. At night, my eyes opened without me realizing I was up. It was still dark outside, and I couldn't understand why my sleep had been broken. I realized why in the next moment. There was the sound of breathing next to my face. In the darkness, I could see the faint outline of a person crouched beside where I lay. I didn't react, scared JJ might get violent if I tried to move. I felt his hand take hold of the blanket and gently remove it to leave me exposed. My heart thumped in my chest. He was simply hunched next to me for several minutes, as if trying to recall a part of my body he'd forgotten about. Then, I felt a finger on my shoulder, causing me to shudder both in fright and disgust. JJ reacted fast and jumped off the bed. I didn't see him leaving, but felt the room go quiet once it was me on the bed alone. Feeling violated, the pent-up rage in me reached its breaking point, and I bolted out of bed and thundered over to JJ's room. The door was locked. I bellowed at him to open the door. I wanted to tell him just how hellish he'd made life for me. From inside, I heard JJ. It wasn't me. It was him. Please go away. He's not in a good mood, JJ begged from behind the door. I slammed on the knob hoping to break in, but just wasn't strong enough. JJ wouldn't open the door either, insisting for me to leave. He was just trying to make you happy again, so you wouldn't miss Dad. JJ's voice was pleading as if failing to understand why I wasn't filled with gratitude. He wanted to satisfy your urges. At that, I stopped attacking the door. JJ had officially crossed the line, and I felt violated, physically and emotionally. I didn't go to bed. Instead, I sat outside the whole night, feeling much safer out there than I ever could in the house. JJ had gone to school by the time I'd woken up. I was about to leave when I saw a diary on his bed. It was the one that had belonged to my husband. I opened a book and my fears were confirmed. In large block letters, I saw several pages filled with everything JJ had done in the past few months. Take pictures of girls. Catch bird wings. Bring underwear to me. The further I ruffled down, the closer I got to the events that had happened. Keep door locked. Don't stop talking to me. Tell Mom she needs me. In the last page, I caught the latest entry. Steal Mom limb key and keep in room. From the freshness of the ink, it was clear these words had only just been written. JJ planned to be in my room tonight. In that moment, I knew I couldn't stay alone with him anymore. I drove over to JJ's school and extracted him from his class. JJ put up an argument, insisting he was just following his friend's advice in what was written in the diary and that it wasn't his decision. But I had enough of his excuses. I revealed everything to the doctor, telling him about JJ's harassment of the girls, his harassment of me, and what he'd written in the diary. The doctor couldn't understand how JJ had spiraled so deep like this and assured me he would treat him right. Despite JJ breaking down in desperation and begging me not to leave him there, I walked away set with my decision. Even at that point, JJ wanted me to take care of his friend. When I arrived at the house, I wanted to feel the relief I craved for so long. It was quiet, with no JJ to scare me anymore. However, I couldn't shake off feeling despondent over how my husband would have felt. How I dumped his only child at a mental institution. I sat on JJ's bed, letting my grief wash over as I held my husband's diary in my hands. My tears fell over the pages, with the freshest writing blotting the parchment as my teardrop fell on the words. The next second, I stood deadly still. There were new words in the diary. Words that hadn't been there the last time I'd opened the book. Let Mom read the book. There was an arrow sign pointing to the next page. Tell Mom to look at the wall. As I looked up, I spotted the wall JJ had once pointed toward. Let Mom push on the circle. It was then I saw the most minuscule of a circular shape on the wall. Placing my palm on it, I found the wall moving inward before falling apart to reveal a small opening. Inside, there was a mat, a few candles, and a man. He was enormous, a boar of a human, with a fat belly that protruded from the sides as well as from the front. He was balding, with only a few wisps of hair that seemed to have been wetted and combed just now. And he was naked, save for briefs that I realized horrifyingly were the same ones that had belonged to my husband. "Hello, Mommy," the man giggled. He was sat on his stomach, with his feet high in the air and crossed, in a manner that teenage girls would lie in when chatting with their crush. "Want to play?" And the man rolled on the mat, his eyes still fixated on me, his giggling only becoming more like a child's, and I realized the mat was an assortment of pictures. All mine. It was now that I realized JJ's friend was real. Tears of terror were trickling down my chin as I stood there with every course of my being wanting to run, but the man was on all fours, ready to pounce. The phone in my hand buzzed, and I managed to take a peek at it. JJ's friend isn't imaginary. He's real. I've called the police. Get out of the house. It was a text from the doctor. As soon as the man caught my eye, he realized what had happened. The next instant, I jumped for the door, managing to shut and lock it. I still didn't feel safe and retreated to my room. I sealed the door and decided to wait it out until the police arrived, backing inside when I felt myself colliding into something from behind. It was the intruder. To my right, I spotted a hole in the wall. It had been him touching me that night. The man brought his arms around me, and I felt myself being buried in his skin, the stench consuming me as I felt all hope ebbing away. From what felt like miles away, I heard the sound of glass breaking. The man was pried off me as I gasped for air. The police had broken in through the window. I saw as the man writhed on the floor, his pudgy frame vibrating as he attempted to pull up the briefs he had wriggled out of before. It turned out he was a sex offender wanted on counts of rape, molestation, and kidnapping. Before the house had been rented by me, this man had been hiding in a makeshift hole in the wall. When we moved in, he'd managed to befriend JJ. The man had learned everything about me and JJ from my husband's diary and used this information to manipulate the child into doing what he wanted. I brought JJ back home soon afterward. He'd been too young and naive to understand the serious danger he and I had been. It took a lot of trips to the child specialist before JJ could confront his grief at losing his father. The same went for me. I'm still in therapy, and I doubt I'll ever be out of it. I lost my husband, and then was close to losing my stepson and my sanity. My therapist had suggested I write this down in my diary, but after the previous incident I had with one, I can never write anything personal down ever again.